Welcome to the Leaders of B2B podcast, a weekly show where we bring you interviews and in the weeds expertise with today's B2B experts and thought leaders. You can see more about today's episode and guest by visiting our website at leadersofb2b.com. This episode is brought to you by Content Allies. We help B2B companies launch revenue-generating podcasts. We schedule interviews between you and your ideal prospects and strategic partners. You show up for engaging conversations, we handle everything else. Ready to build a podcast that grows your business in just 1 hour per week? Reach out to us at contentallies.com.
Hey leaders, welcome back. This is Ledge. Today I am welcoming Dimitri Sirota to the show. Dimitri, I'd love if you would give an introduction of yourself and your work, and we'll get diving in, answering some good questions.
Thank you, Lex. So hello, everybody. My name is Dimitri Sirota. I'm the CEO of a company called BigID, which I started about 2016 with a co-founder in Israel. We're a little bit over 500 people. We've been selling software since about 2018, focused on helping organizations better know their data in terms of what's sensitive, what's regulated, what's valuable. So we have customers around the world. We are headquartered technically in New York, but we have staff on 6 of the 7 continents and customers on 6 of the 7 continents as well. And again, we tie into this whole kind of thesis around data as the currency of the new digital enterprise. And, you need to secure it. You need to make sure that you're compliant with these new data regulations. And then in this advent of new AI age, how do you find the data that you're going to use for your AI? Where's the good stuff, the Glenn Gary, Glenn Ross data?
Nice. I love the reference. That's interesting. Gosh, there's a lot of talk about there, and I want to get into startup journey and, I'm big into that stuff, but, let's sit in that sort of data and security and classification and kind of just knowing what you're up against, right? As an enterprise now, any enterprise just generates an outrageous amount of data, right? And it all goes in somewhere. And we used to call this big data, and we used to, and then there was a little bit of machine learning, and there was, so all the things there. Now it's AI, but the reality is that companies generate data. You need to understand it. You need to keep it safe. It's like, this is just a monumental challenge now. We make data faster than we ever have before. I think what is like 90% of all the information ever has been generated in the last 2 years or something. Yeah, so, I'd love to talk
Sure.
about that.
So look, I think the pace of data generation has expanded. I don't know if it's exactly exponential or geometrical, but it's growing rapidly. And part of that is just, I think, the advent of the cloud. Part of that is that we moved kind of almost completely online, right? I still remember in 2001, 2002, e-commerce seemed like a new thing. And that was really our only kind of interaction. But look at us now. Here we are doing a podcast over digitally. I pay all my bills digitally. My banks
Right.
don't send me letters anymore. They interact with me digitally. I raise money for my company, certainly during COVID, digitally. I didn't meet some of the people that gave us money in person. And I think, we've kind of shifted from just a small part of our life that was online, maybe mail, to basically everything, whether it's TikTok, whether it's how we interact with other businesses, with other software developers. Look at BigID. We have, I think, staff in now probably about 50, 60 cities around the world. My co-founder is 7 hours time difference from me. And so again, because of this kind of digitization, everything is online. And every time we interact, every time you and I talk, a bit and byte get generated, right? Like an angel gets its wing, and that gets stored somewhere on the internet. And while this may not be as sensitive or worrisome, the reality is so much of the data we generate, whether it's our W-2s, whether it's our employee forms, whether it's a new schematic that I built for an aeroplane, Some of that is sensitive, right? And some of that is valuable, right? My contract, this is the end of the quarter, my contract with a new customer, those are high value things. And I think what's happened is a lot of the tooling that helps organizations figure out, where's that high value data that I have, you know, to borrow a metaphor, is kind of from the era of Galileo, kind of looking out with his kind of hand-built telescope at Jupiter, being amazed by kind of seeing this thing, this object, maybe in the distance. I don't know if he saw Saturn or not, but the world has changed. And so what we kind of introduced is, I'd like to describe as a world-changing technology, in the sense that we help organizations know their data, right? If you want to get value from your data, you got to know where the high value data is. If you want to comply with various regulations, whether they're privacy or HIPAA for healthcare or PCI for payment card data, you got to know where the data is. If you want to safeguard your data, right? If you want to protect it from rogue employees, criminal actors, you got to know where it is, because your data is not like a Klingon warbird. It doesn't have a cloaking device. Just because you don't know where it is doesn't mean a bad person can't figure out where it is. And so part of the genesis, the big idea of BigID, is knowing your data is the first step to not just extracting value, right? Whether it's for analytics or AI, but it's also the first step in being able to ensure that you could safeguard that, ensure its integrity, protected from nefarious actors, and help regulators know that you're compliant with a privacy payment card, whatever that is. And so that's kind of our thesis. And I think the technologies, those Galileo era technologies, maybe Copernicus, maybe a little bit later, that were developed kind of at the very dawn of the internet, are probably not the same technologies you want to use today in a more AI driven, cloud native world.
Right, right. And this is a crude example, but I know from a compliance standpoint, I think about like let's say we run businesses or startups on Google Workspace, and periodically I'll get, emails and say, hey, this spreadsheet looks like it maybe has, PII in it and it's shared with an external source. So, I mean, that's like, it's trying to catalog all kinds of stuff based on some kind of, recognition. And I can imagine that when you're not a startup with 6 seats or something that, you talk about thousands and thousands of seats and endpoints and edge computing and people at home. And I mean, it just like becomes this massively complex issue of where the hell does that even live?
Yeah, and it doesn't, like, I think, again, if you go back to that dawn of time that I mentioned, and maybe Galileo is the wrong metaphor, but early, maybe 19th century is kind of a better, Marie Curie, maybe she's a better metaphor, chosen period. But you're dealing with kind of a world that in the late 90s, early 2000s, comprised of a SQL server from Oracle, a mainframe from IBM, an Exchange server from Microsoft. Um, it was a very simple kind of data environment. Um, you fast forward to today, there are thousands of different places you have data, right? They could be in Office 365, they could be in SharePoint, they could be in Teams, could be in Slack, they could be in code repositories like a GitHub or a GitLab or a Bitbucket. They could be in Salesforce, and Salesforce is of the CRM. There's the marketing cloud, there's the commerce cloud. It could be in Workday. Again, lots and lots of places, thousands. It could be in a MongoDB. And even a MongoDB, is it in the graph database or is it in the document database? And so data has kind of permeated so many different places. And now people talk about vector databases for AI. It's everywhere. And knowing that data, not only as it gets created or shared, but also just being able to track it, has become a bigger and bigger problem, especially as I've kind of departed my data center. I think there was a time when enterprises had this false sense of security because they knew they had a security guard at the door at their data center. They knew they maybe had a Palo Alto firewall at the perimeter, and they felt pretty good. I didn't need to know exactly what was inside because I knew it was in New Jersey. When somebody would ask me, "Where's your data?" I would tell them it's in New Jersey. And so I
As somebody from New Jersey, I could tell you that's probably not the best metaphor for safety, but whatever.
I'd probably say with an accent, "It's in New Jersey, yeah." Uh, and,
Yeah,
and that was good enough. But now that the data is kind of smeared like a fine cream
right.
cheese on a New York bagel, all over in thousands of different places, and I've got to pick through it, and I've got to comply with all these crazy regulations, some made by the Europeans, some made by the Californians, and figure out what data belongs to Dimitri, or what data is a new chip design that I got to make sure it doesn't leave the U.S. Or what data is a credit card? Because credit cards can be stored in 1,000 different ways, in 10,000 different places. It gets really, really hard. And so we had to kind of start again, start in something that's cloud native, start in a way that accommodating all these different places, these kind of various cream cheese, the bagel that you could support, um, and be able to pick out not only what kind of data, who it belongs to, where it's been, where it's going, what is valuable about it. Is it a patent? Is it a contract? Is it an employee form? Is it a mortgage application? And so that was kind of the genesis of Big ID, Big Idea, Big ID.
Well, it's just a tiny little challenge. So now that you nailed that, no, I get it. That's like, that's enormous. And I guess I'm thinking like in my rudimentary knowledge of data schemes and classifications and such, we would have, you would, you need to have some sense of like a metadata or classification or something labeling like this is data of this certain type. And here are all the things we know about it. So it's almost like a giant database of all
Yeah.
your data, which I imagine itself is massive data. It just seems like it's this like recursive nightmare of a problem. Like, how do you even begin to take that
Yeah. Well,
apart?
look, you do use machine learning AI, right? The reality is, I think um, I would have more shelves and more things on my shelves if everybody used Big ID. They don't. Many do, but not everyone. And the reality is, what you just described in terms of like poor human operator, a Brian, your producer, needs to go and look
Right.
into the data and say, you know what, I'm going to
Right.
take a look at that. And that sure looks a lot like email. Or you know what, I think that's a chip design. That is still how it happens. The problem is that is a losing proposition. There are not enough people skilled in the art of looking at data to be able to make sense of describing what is valuable and describing what is risky. There just isn't. Whether you call them a data stewards or a data analyst, the world doesn't have enough of these people, enough programs to teach them. And the data is just outpacing their ability to process it, right? And so this is where you need machine learning, where you need AI, where you need technologies that could bypass that old world of having humans do everything manually and do things automatically. And look, we're approaching that inflection. Um, and to some degree, our competition is really that inertia from doing things manually. But what's happening now in the market, kind of to your point, is they can't keep up. So they're focusing on less and less and less and less data. And at some point, when you're under 1% of your data environment, it becomes useless because at the end of the day, you want to have a 360-degree picture of your information, right? Just like if you're doing data personalization and marketing, you want to have a 360-degree picture of your customer, how they've interacted with you. You need that for your data. And again, that's where companies like Big ID come in because that's what we do. We use automation, machine learning, AI techniques to make sense of that data at scale.
Right. Right. The picture you just described feels to me like you can sort of ultimately fingerprint a particular type of data that we just like we can now look at it, or the machine can look at it because it's beyond human comprehension, and kind of go, oh, that's a video file. It's about this, and it has a reference to this plan or something of that nature, like to really draw out the context of what matters and, what doesn't. How in the hell do you sell such a thing? I mean, it's so freaking complex, and it's like a extra solution on top of the bazillions of dollars that people are, spending on technology anyway. And my guess is that every solution kind of says they do part of this. So you're a point solution that goes with everything else. Like
Right.
these are hard problems that I think a lot of people go
Yeah, look,
through.
I think, look, obviously markets evolve. And I think when you start and, your podcast is really geared to kind of business leaders. One thing you find in technology is you anticipate a market, right? You don't start a business typically when the market exists. You typically are making a wager and that the market is there's a new market, what sometimes people refer to as kind of a blue ocean. Something will appear, or conversely, you're saying that something is going to change about the way I do things, right? So, for instance, Snowflake, which some of your audience will be familiar with, believe that just like Salesforce replaced like PeopleSoft, or sorry, or Siebel for CRM, cloud is going to change everything. So, why am I going to do data warehousing on-prem? I'll go to the cloud. In a similar way, we kind of bet that in the future, data was going to be a bigger problem. Now, when we started, we did have a tailwind. There was new regulations that said, thou shalt, right? Almost like a 10 commandments that if you don't do this, you're going to get a penalty. And those regulations were typically around privacy. So 2018, GDPR came out. In 2020, um, California's version of GDPR, CCPA came out. Today, I think there's 160 of these laws. I think something like 8 in the US, and more overseas internationally. And they kind of created a tailwind, right? Just like if you're a sailor, those are great if you're trying to get across the bay. They kind of said, look, you got to do this. You got to tell customers what data you have on them. It's not an option. You got to do it. And you can't do it with the technology that existed before. Um, so we took advantage of that tailwind, right? Just like a kind of like a current. And I go, oh, yeah, that's great. We're going to be able to kind of set sail with that. And that's how we kind of started, right? That was enough as a catalyst to get us started. But we always knew from our inception that the problem was bigger, right? It touched on not just compliance, but also security, but also this kind of whole notion of value creation, right? Finding that good stuff that is going to drive my analytics and drive my other kind of business operation. How do I make money in a digital enterprise? Um, but the telling of that story in the early days, not only did we have the benefit of these regulations, so it wasn't like, people were setting aside dollars to spend on products already. But at the end of the day, if you go to a stakeholder or even a board, right, and ask them something as simple, are you worried about your data getting stolen? I don't think the board member could say no, right? I think they would probably be run off that board, right? I don't think a CEO could say, you know what, it's not my data, so what do I care, right? Everybody cares about the data that they're essentially custodians of, right? Their customer data, their employee data, their partners' data. So I think that the days of trying to be an evangelist are gone. Now, we obviously have a proposition around a kind of tool. And in the early days, like 2019, we were, yelling at the wind and you need to kind of do it differently. And, you need to reimagine, rethink whatever Apple talked about in the 80s. And we were doing that. I think the market has grown. Now I would say, Microsoft is also evangelizing this. Just today, Palo Alto bought a much smaller competitor of ours. I think they were about 2 or 3 million in revenue, but Palo Alto now has drunk in the Kool-Aid. So I do think that we are not alone, yelling into the wind anymore. I think people are going to get this message, whether they're security practitioners, clients and risk practitioners, privacy professionals, or even people whose job it is to build value from the data that they collect on their customers and then partners.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thing in the entrepreneurial journey is that timing, that sort of you take a bet based on a change that you can see coming based on your collection of experiences. But the reality is that that's like a well-informed bet. You just don't know. Like if it hadn't been a certain mix of things that happen and you had to wait out a 10-year, gap on that instead of a 6. Like, I think that's the mystery of, the entrepreneurial gamble is like, how good am I at sensing the future moves
Yeah.
with an actual time frame? And a lot of people, fall into that. I know I have. It's like, well, that thing that I did 10 years ago would have been right now, but I ran out of cash waiting.
Look, I have, this is my third company. So I have, some stories along that. My last company was
Please.
an API security company. And we started in 2003. And honestly, people couldn't sell API. And I'm not sure if all of your audience even knows what an API is, but it's an application programmatic interface. And it's really about how do you let applications talk to one another programmatically, right? Where you don't have to have a person in the middle, right? Similar to the way I was talking about, looking at the data. You don't want to have a person kind of, with glasses kind of going, oh, you know what? I don't have the right prescription to be able to understand the data. That's the wrong way to do it, but that's the way it was done. And in a similar way, people would talk to an application. They would then get a form or a document, and then they would send it to another application. And that kind of man in the middle or monkey in the middle, if you want to be more generous, obviously can't scale. So we believe that, okay, well, you're going to need a way for systems directly. And we were kind of at the end and we said, oh my God, we got the idea. If you're going to be doing this, but then you need to kind of introduce doors, right? What if I don't want everything to go? I want to create filters. What if like some of this information is proprietary, like personal data? And so we said, okay, you're going to need kind of like a router firewall to be able to control flow of information. That was the thesis, fantastic thesis, proved completely correct. Today, that is how we talk to our mobile apps. That is how we talk to the cloud. That is how applications in the cloud talk to one another. But boy, do we miss the timing of it. Um, we were basically wandering the kind of biblical desert, right? I forget the character in the Old Testament. Just wandering around. I guess that was Moses. I guess that character, very important character. Very big part of the Old Testament. Uh, and yeah, and we were just early, and it really didn't change for us until Apple came out with the iPhone. I think then they opened up, if you remember, and again, I don't know how you look like a very young man, but so I don't know if you remember it. You're probably born right around the time of the Apple phone. Uh, uh, but then they opened it up to apps. And those are like little
Yeah.
applications that sit on your device and they need to talk to things that sit elsewhere. So people go, oh my God, light bulb. And then Amazon came out with web services. Web services is another, a little bit more of an antiquated um,
Yep.
term for APIs. And so all of a sudden, we went from like literally like, kind of again, Old Testament person kind of preaching and talking about like this or that to by 2009, 2010, people got it, right? It was still early days, but they got it. And I think that proverb, again, I don't want to overuse the kind of metaphors around the Bible. That proverb is, I think, important for anybody starting a business. Timing does matter. I think timing, like execution, right? You can have a thesis, but as Wayne
Yeah.
Gretzky said, you need to be able to go not only know where the puck is going, but you actually need to
Skate.
know how to skate
Go.
to the puck, right? It's not enough to know that it's going into the corner. You got to actually have the talent to skate to it before the opposing team. Um, and so look, you got to have that combination. Big idea was better, but still it was obviously early. So that timing is always a hard thing to do. And candidly, it's that kind of balance. timing and execution, um, to get that scale, that is business in a nutshell, right? That is what everyone listening to your podcast is here to learn. And all of us are probably practitioners of in our own small way.
And so I've noticed that you're pretty prolific angel investor, at least based on LinkedIn. There's all kinds of companies you're, involved in. Certainly that's one of the lessons like you're paying attention to as an advisor. And you've done this, 3 times. You've had some exits. You've obviously had successes. Like what is that story now? Like Dimitri, the angel investor advisor, like I can picture you kind of holding court over, some entrepreneur meetings with a bunch of metaphors and,
Uh,
you're got this whole like Oracle from Miami thing going on.
yeah.
I want to know
The
the story
Oracle
here.
from Miami. Yeah, look, and at some raid late at night. Um, look,
I want to hear the
yeah,
juice, man. I think you have
look, I
stories.
have, what I will say is angels obviously do these things, but to some degree, like angels, they do it out of the decency of their heart. Because fortunately for angels, you don't need money in heaven. At least that's what I'm told. I'm not religious. That's what I'm told. Because it's not necessarily a great way to get rich. It's a fantastic way to be involved with younger entrepreneurs. It's sometimes fun. It's been less fun probably in the last couple of years, just with the economy the way it is. Um, but it's entertainment as much as anything else. To be very very candid,
Right.
I think there are a few. We all love to hear the stories about the angels that invested in Uber or invested in Pinterest or Facebook. The reality is historically pre-COVID, a lot of them were kind of on the inside, right? Small groups that got to see the best deals, the pick of the litter, so to speak, in a very small community in Silicon Valley. Today, as everything's become more diffused post-COVID, people kind of spread out around the world, and the center of gravity or the center of the universe is no longer Silicon Valley. Um, I think it's a hard thing to do. Great entertainment, some successes, right? Successes are a huge amount of fun. Lots of missed opportunities. There's another deal that Palo Alto is going to be announcing in a couple of weeks. I had a chance to invest. I didn't invest. And that was too expensive or something else. And so, obviously people, when those happen, there's a lot of patient waiting, right? These things don't flower in a year, or in most cases, 2 years or 3 years. I think the average company takes 7 to 10 years to get some kind of closure, and sometimes that closure is failing. Um, but look, it's fun. Um, I probably slowed it a little bit, but yes, I have probably a little bit over 20 investments currently, with another kind of probably 5 or 6 funds that I've invested in. It's a great way to lose money, but I guess if you're going to lose money on the stock market, or lose it this way, pick your poison. I think, fortunately for me, I lose it both ways. So, well, yeah,
Well, I love that. I've never heard somebody call it edutainment, but I completely understand that. I mean, you in fact do you can have the sort of the fun of being involved in, the sort of staying with the young, scrappy entrepreneurs, and you have like you're gonna learn something from every experience. And I think like that sort of is a very well-rounded personal thesis
yeah,
there. Like I kind of I just knowing you for 20 minutes, I feel like that kind of speaks to
yeah. Look, and
your
I think
character. You seem
I
like
think there's
that
a
guy.
certain realistic, reality to this, right? And I think at the end of the day, we all want to win the Mega Millions lottery, right? The 1.8 billion. We know that the number of Ubers that get created at any particular period is small, right? And candidly, there hasn't been one in a while. Um, what's interesting, I think, over the last, certainly during COVID, company creation exploded, and not just in Silicon Valley, which, had the lion's share, but everywhere, right? VCs could fund without going in face-to-face meetings. So, the old kind of, you used to have this kind of old adage, VCs want it to be within 2 hours drive of the company, and they wouldn't invest unless they were within that kind of radius. what does that mean during COVID, right? When everyone's at home, you're not driving 2 hours, you're not driving at all. Everything just kind of exploded. So people were funded in every corner of the world. And people were getting funded without meeting, just over on Zoom. And so I do think we're in this kind of period where like there is an incredible number of companies that are being funded over the last kind of 2, 3 years. To some degree, there's a glut, and they have to get kind of digested. They have, and so look, we're going through a kind of Cambrian explosion, right? These kind of epochal periods or end of epochs, right? I think we got 5 or 6 of them in history where, you have this kind of explosion of life and then a meteorite comes and blows it all up. And, like a small percentage of them survive. So I think we're kind of about to we're already kind of sliding into that. But like I said, look, it's fantastic to get to be part of it. Talking to one company I invested in the UK, they have an offer. Nothing I would say to write home about, but they have one. And it's great to kind of talk through with them, how they're thinking about it, along with some of their other options. So I think, look, but I do think it's important to highlight that it's entertainment. If one of these companies succeed, and obviously I hope they all do, and I have like several that are on paper kind of unicorns, but it's on paper, right? As soon as that paper gets converted into currency, I'll be much happier. And I'm sure they'll be much happier. But right now, I have to settle for the paper.
So I got to know, like, you have this collection of broad activities and experiences. You speak in all kinds of metaphors. You're obviously well read. I'm going to guess you like history the way you talk about it. It's just like, what, what could you, what could you summarize in, a few minutes of that whole journey? Like just what, what made Dimitri today, versus like if you could kind of, send a handwritten note back to yourself, 25 years ago, like that space in between is always real interesting to me in that
Yeah, look, I
entrepreneurial
think
journey.
again, if you go back in time far enough, you may be familiar with a book called "What Color Is Your Parachute?" And it's really, I think there is another book, which, by the way, I haven't read any of these books, so nothing will bore me more than reading a business book. Um, but there was another one around kind of what, you're finding your true north or some ridiculous kind of coaching metaphor. The one, the, and look, you probably don't need, you could probably just read the headline or the title and kind of get everything.
Well, now I have AI that can just give
Yeah,
me one
give me
paragraph
Cole's
about it.
notes.
I'm good. So,
So look, I think at the end of the day, you have to be kind of true to yourself. I'm not, so my background is actually a little bit unusual in the sense that I grew up in a place called Winnipeg, which people that follow hockey may know of from the Jets. People that don't follow hockey, it's a miserable, terrible place in the middle of nowhere. Where North Dakota was looked upon as like, oh, that's an exciting place like 9 hours south. Um, and look, obviously, this is before the technology industry kind of emerged at the same scale and level as it is today. And my dream was to be a physicist. So I was not thinking about being a tech entrepreneur in any path. But I did pursue it. I did graduate studies in physics. And then I just kind of realized, you know what? The pace of it, the deliberateness, right? Working on one paper for 2 years, working in a basement all the time, not being able to afford clothes, didn't seem like a seat to me. And it just happened to be a time kind of the tech industry. Like I think, the Mozilla browser came out. I said, hey, that looks a lot more interesting. Why don't I kind of pivot and kind of go to that? But I do think we all, and by the way, I didn't code. Um, I, I could pick up the language of technology pretty quickly, but I've never been a coder. I wasn't a salesperson. The closest I was to sales was working my parents' jewelry store, selling poor nervous guys a wedding band or an engagement ring when I was a teenager. And so you pick up what you need to pick up, right? I think being adaptable is important and being thoughtful. Look, I am like I do read a lot of history. I read a lot, period. Uh, but I do think that there is no one path, right? You don't have to be that athlete because God knows I was not that athlete. You don't have to be that exceptional genius at coding. You don't have to be that person that just rolled out of Stanford with 15 patents because they ran AI and they ran a department. there are many things to get to where you were, but what it does take is some splunk, um, and that stick to itness. You obviously get better. I think this is even though we deal in technology, this is an interpersonal game, right? I think you need to be decent to your employees, and your customers, maybe make them laugh on occasion. So I think at the end of the day, what I would say for me is there wasn't kind of like a clear, like, oh, hey, he did all of these things as a buildup, right? There's this kind of natural
Right.
stair step. I think to some degree, I pivoted when I would need to be pivoted, just like in terms of identifying an idea. I think there's always kind of an attempt to be decent, realizing this is not blood sport, that it is, whether it's angel investing or whatever, it's an occupation, right? I do this because it seems like the best of a bunch of bad choices, right? I could work somewhere else, but this seems pretty decent. Miami, I get, the hanging out outside. And I think obviously striving and working hard are all important. But to some degree, I think, you need to take advantage of opportunities as they present themselves and not be afraid to kind of go down that path. Right. And it does take some commitment. It's obviously hugely risky. And it's easier to take risks when you're 29 than it is when you're 59. I'm not, just to be clear for the audience. But it is right. So anyway, so I think if there's one adage I would leave is like, be thoughtful, be decent, and don't be afraid to take a risk.
He's definitely 39 for those who are not watching the video.
It's like 29 and a half.
No, I love that. And I resonate because I've not been the one that ever made the like plan with the stair step people. And I talk to people like that every day, that we do the interviews and it's like, I knew from like minute one out of college that I was going to set up my dominoes and I was going to do it this way. And by this age, I was going to be this thing. I could personally say I completely failed out of like every even tiny little objective that I had set for myself. And so I just stopped setting them and started paying attention to, I don't know, what does it look like when people are making money and having a decent time in their life? And let me just go talk to
Yeah,
them.
look, honestly, look, you couldn't have been thinking I'm going to be a podcaster before podcasting was invented, right? Back in the days when it still went, before the mobile phones were around. So look, I do think that we're all going to be presented, and I have a couple of boys, and I talked to them about AI, right? Maybe coming full circle to where we start, and talking about Brian being your AI. Um, AI to me feels like a major inflection. Now, there's going to be a lot of wasted money, including some for me, in terms of angel investments. Not everything is going to be successful. You're going to have so much experimentation. It's like the early days of the trains, right? There was like, I don't know, hundreds of private train companies. There obviously isn't today, and there will be a shakeout, but it does seem like where there's a new thing that is going to change the game. And obviously, we're taking advantage of from a data standpoint. When I tell my boys, and I do tell them, like, look, this industry that I'm in, this tech industry, can't be beat. I get to work from home. I travel around to exotic places. I get to talk on podcasts like yours. Um, but there is an opportunity, a window, and you can get on that kind of tailwind that I talked about. There is a current in the ocean, and I think AI is definitely going to be something that tells the industry for the next 15 or so years.
Yeah, it's a nice segue because first of all, I am also the parent of two boys and three girls. So, I think about this all the time. Like y'all like pay attention to you don't get to see, sort of once in a lifetime pivots and shifts in this way. And maybe it's not, maybe it's once a generation because it's the same way I talk like y'all get to carry around like a little glowing piece of glass in your pocket with all the information in the whole world. When we didn't know things, we just were dumb. We didn't know that.
It's a lot or
You
open
didn't
up an
get that.
encyclopedia.
Right. Right. Exactly. But it was out of date because those are expensive and, God help you. Right. Like, you just didn't know. And I don't know. I just asked somebody who might know, or I didn't know the answer. And there's that. And they kind of go, oh, that's weird. And I just bought the new VR headset. I'm just like, this do you understand that you can strap your head into a totally different high
Well,
def
you can
universe and
teleport.
like that is
Teleport. Can you
crazy?
imagine? You can teleport. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. I just got lost in the thing last night playing games and I'm like, this is
yeah,
bizarre. Like
getting one
it's
of my.
just amazing stuff. And then obviously the AI is just like outrageous, like the explosion of like actual tactical usefulness. Like I use this thing every day that didn't exist 10 years ago or 10 months ago. And so, I love that. And then like I told you at the beginning, I love to ask people like, okay, what must be on everyone's radar who's listening to this, like to add to their sort of like, don't miss this. And I think it's like the unique perspective that you bring, from your experiences, from the whole collection of all the things, and then in the right now, the inflection point of AI. How do you see that? Like, what will you tell the business
Yes.
leaders?
Look, I think obviously you need to kind of dive in head first. We obviously talk to companies. I can tell you that a lot of the enterprise companies we're doing are they're experimenting. They're doing things right now. I would still say that they're kind of toy experiments. Um, I will differ with you for in one area. I actually think the frequency of these kind of dislocations are happening faster and faster and faster. Right? I think the before the internet, there was client server. Before client server, there was I forget like a mini server or something like I don't know. It was before my time. For that, there was kind of mainframe compute, kind of shared storage. And since then, we've seen like the internet. There was kind of e-commerce, and there was cloud, and there was mobile.
Mhm.
More recently, there was crypto. We all remember, like, especially here in Miami, like you can go out without having like somebody in their Ferrari or what's like the car with the bull that they all loved. Uh,
Brigatti? I don't
yeah,
even know.
what are those? But I think AI, look, it's hard to imagine that you're going to be able to do anything without it, right? I think this idea of having people look at stuff and make
Mm,
decisions just seems kind of quaint, right? Whether it's by looking at data, given the volume that's getting created, um, whether it's trying to look at kind of like a sonogram of a baby or maybe radiological image. I think it's just look, it's going to be everywhere. It's going to be pervasive. No, I do think there will be other revolutions. We've had others around material sciences and so forth. Maybe superconductivity finally happens. Um,
or quantum or
yeah,
fusion. I
look,
mean, there's a lot of
people are
stuff
doing
that'll
work. I
support.
think we're probably at the advent of commercial fusions, and I think some of these things go quickly. I think EVs surprisingly went relatively quickly, even though you had one company. Now it's all EVs, right? I went from never having any EVs to, we have one gas powered car left. Um, but I do think it's important for people to kind of get familiar with it. And one thing I'll say is you don't have to be just a scientist to make sense of it. I think people like me and maybe you who are kind of, we can read about stuff, we could kind of make sense of things. It's not just limited to this kind of priesthood of developers. I think you could be involved in that business without being an expert on large language models or vector databases or transformers. And I do think that whether you embrace that, or maybe you would embrace some kind of, new way, just like the vaccine, just experience was a new way of kind of building vaccine. One of the co-founders got a Nobel Prize this year, in physiology. I do think that kind of looking for these opportunities, these kind of dislocations, these disruptions, these changes is important and committing, right? Jumping on, taking a risk. And I think that's the part kind of as I highlighted before. So all 5 years. So, and who knows? Maybe that dislocation is TikTok. So there's always two.
I definitely feel dislocated when I look at TikTok.
Well,
I'm not sure that
you
I
look,
don't think I'm
oh
ever
yeah,
going to stand under.
yeah, you and I both.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Dimitri, this is a blast. You're hilarious. And, it's like I can sense the wisdom and I love it. Thanks for coming out. But anybody that's, kind of resonating or wants to learn more about you or the company, what channels are you on and, how do they find you?
I'm on all the digital channels except for TikTok. And they could email me at BigID. They could email me at dsirota at Gmail, which is my personal account. So feel free. And as a famous Vancouverite where I used to live once said, call me maybe.
Dimitri, thanks so much for hanging out. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.